Okay, so this Stephen Lee essay is Why Had the Republic Not Collapsed by 1923? Just revisiting a point I've made in previous podcasts. The advantage of using these Stephen Lee essays is that you can learn about structure, which will help you with your own planning when you write essays in the examination. And I frequently emphasise that examiners, when they mark your essays, will scan. They will take a quick overview to get a sense of the structure by looking at the opening sentences of each paragraph. These are my notes from Stephen Lee, where I've effectively turned the paragraphs into headings with bullet points. So again, just take a quick overview and get a sense of the structure. Look at the headings and get an idea of the structure of the answer here. So as you can see, he gives an overview for the introduction. We'll come back to that in a second. He looks at the specific weaknesses of extreme left-wing opposition, and he then looks at the specific weaknesses of the far-right opposition. So he talks about specifics, the weaknesses of the opposition, and then he looks at the general points, the weaknesses that were common to both the far left and the far right. But then he counterbalances his argument by saying it was not just the weaknesses of the opposition. We must also remember that the government survived because it had strengths. And then finally, down at the bottom here, I didn't underline it, but it's a heading, the external factors that helped the Republic to survive. And that again kind of goes back to the start, the introduction, where it's important to show synoptic knowledge, to be able to relate your knowledge of Germany during this specific period to wider factors. And remember, I said try to look at it as a horizontal and vertical. Okay, that's the vertical. Vertical is kind of like you can make synoptic points by looking forwards in time or backwards in time, and then horizontally you can look at that time other countries. Okay, and obviously down here the reference to external factors, other countries like France and Britain, and why and how those factors helped Germany survive is a horizontal synoptic point. Okay, so let's now zoom in and look at the details. So, interesting, there is a vertical synoptic point, the overview. Okay, remember what I said, making synoptic points, you can do it horizontally looking at that time period to other countries, but you can also look forwards or backwards. So what Lee does here in his introduction is he says that the early 1930s seemed to be threatening, but if you compare it to the later crisis, which was the Great Depression 1929 to 32, which brought to power Hitler and resulted in the collapse of the Republic, you could argue that the crisis of 1923 was superficial and it was less destabilising than the crisis that happened 10 years later. So it's a good synoptic point. You're going to be writing introductions in the exam for your essays. Introductions provide that opportunity for you to put the question into its broader context, either horizontally or vertically or both. Okay, to show that wider awareness of how that question fits into the bigger jigsaw puzzle, okay, of history. Okay, so specific weaknesses of the extreme left-wing opposition then, specific weaknesses. So in the previous essay, for which I've done a podcast, we looked at who the extreme left were and how they were a threat, so I won't go back into that. Spartacists and strikes and Saxony and Thuringia, etc. Never accounted, the left-wing opposition never accounted for more than 15% of the vote in elections. Okay, it's obviously a key point. bids for power failed because they were disorganised. And again, there's a good synoptic point there. The comparison with the Bolsheviks in Russia. The Bolshevik Party in Russia were schooled and extremely professional in their conspiratorial tactics, whereas the Spartacists, January 1919, but other communist revolts, Saxony, Thuringia, the Ruhr, etc., in the early 1920s, were very disorganised. They were more spontaneous strike movements. They were politically motivated, but they lacked the organisational abilities. They lacked a Bolshevik party, a Lenin, a Trotsky. Also, the working classes in Germany were mainly unionised. And so when kind of potentially radicalised workers who were talking about revolution met together, often the trade union leaders would take hold of the meeting and argue that revolution was not the right course, that evolutionary change, gradual change, putting pressure on the government through parliamentary structures, etc., was the correct and right technique. Okay. And the trade union leaders were linked to the SPD, and the SPD refused to back the KPD. So again, it comes back to that division within the extreme left. Very, very important that you any question on the period World War I, 1918 to 1919 to 23, you will almost certainly need to be talking about the divisions within the political left. Okay. Lee then moves into the specific weaknesses of the far right. Now again, like the political left, the far right were disorganised, they were divided. Okay, so fragmented into small Volkish groups which often competed against each other. Okay, so the Volkish groups were the racist right wing. Now they were a product of the pressure groups from before World War One. Remember the Pan-German leagues, for example, the army leagues, where in particular middle classes and especially the lower middle classes, the Mittelstand, were mobilised by the Kaiser behind patriotic ideas. And these groups then, after World War One, fueled by the Freikorps, fueled by the stab in the back, entered politics. And obviously the most famous example of that were the Nazi Party, but there were countless other Volkish groups. And that was part of the problem. There were so many of them in operation throughout Germany in this period that they often didn't compete against each other. Secondly, you've got the conservative right wing. Now, although they are similar to the Volkish right wing in terms of their sympathies, they hate the government in Berlin, for the stab in the back, believe the government in Berlin were November criminals, they condemned the Treaty of Versailles, all of those reasons. The key difference is, remember, the conservative right were drawn from the old ruling elites of the Kaiserreich. They were upper class, they were landowners, they were the conservative groups. And unlike the Volkish groups, which usually operated underground, the conservative right were very open. They had the jobs in the Republic. They had the top jobs, whether it's in the army or in the judiciary or in the civil service. Okay, they're in sympathy with the Volkish right, but the Volkish groups did not have the full cooperation of the conservative right. Okay, now the German Nationalist Party, for example, was conservative right wing. Okay, it was the main political party of the conservative right wing. They were very suspicious of the social origins of the Volkish parties, because the Volkish parties, such as the Nazi Party, on the whole were drawn from the lower middle class, even from the kind of upper working class, if there is such a term, the lumpen proletariat, sort of like blue-collar workers, etc. Working classes with some education, some political motivation. So, for example, 1923 Munich Putsch, at the last minute, Gustav von Kahr, who was a conservative nationalist, the leader of the right-wing government in Bavaria, and Bavaria, remember, had acted as a haven, as a greenhouse for the Nazi movement and other Volkish right-wing movements. At the last minute, it withdrew its support for the Nazis, prompted by Hitler's very bullish behaviour at the 11th hour. The far-right Volkish groups were perceived of as being thuggish, and as a result they did not yet have the support of people like Gustav von Kahr, the leader of the Bavarian government, people like Lossow, the head of the army in Bavaria, Seisser, the head of the police in Bavaria, and Siecht, the commander-in-chief of the German army nationally. So, for example, go back to 1920, Siecht may not have stopped Kahr in 1920. They famously, remember, soldiers do not shoot on soldiers, but he didn't support him either. Okay, so that's important. Okay, so you can over-egg the point that about soldiers do not shoot on soldiers, but they didn't join them either. There was always that kind of like, we will not go that far, we want to march with and join in. Lutwitz did, obviously, so that's what you've got to be careful not to talk in extremes. Siecht urged Kahr not to support the Nazis in 1923, which was probably a factor in why Kahr withdrew his support from the Nazis at the 11th hour. Okay. Weaknesses of both the far left and the far right. Both struggled to persuade the bulk of the population that another change of regime was necessary. Okay. Bottom line is they didn't convince the bulk of the population. These were high-profile, moments like Cat Putsch and the Munich Putsch. They hit the headlines, but the majority of the population were not convinced to follow them. And also, neither left nor right had a charismatic personality as a leader. Okay, think about the political left. No strong leader for the extreme left. Okay, likewise, and I know you could argue on the right wing Hitler was the exception, but remember, Hitler and the Nazis were very much on the fringe at this point. They were not a national party, they were Bavarian. Okay, so no dominant sort of personality as yet to emerge. Now, very importantly then, and this is an area that is often forgotten about and neglected by candidates in the exam, because you become so focused in talking about the weaknesses of the Weimar government 1920-23 with the coalitions and all those sorts of things, that we forget that under Hebert, the president, there was significant strength. So just quickly go through these points. The two successful examples of mass action were mobilised by the government. Okay, so in 1920, the SPD used the trade unions to mobilise a strike that paralysed the Cat Putsch. The Cat Putsch was brought down in March 1920 because the Berlin workers went on strike, and that strike was mobilised by the government. Hebert used Article 48 to deal with the Cat Putsch. And again in 1923, when the French invaded the Ruhr in January, there was a campaign of civil disobedience, passive resistance. We often forget, because we get so focused on the later hyperinflation, that actually that passive resistance was mobilised by the government. So the two examples of mass action were both led by Hebert. Okay. B. The President took firm action against threats of disruption, e.g. President Hebert used Article 48 to deal with both the Cap and Munich Putschs on the far right and the Spartacist Ruhr and Saxon threats on the left. Thus Article 48 was used to save the Republic. For example, in the latter the government declared a national state of emergency and transferred political power to regional military commanders. Okay, now obviously there's a counter-argument to that. There was a price to pay by handing so much power to the German army. You could argue that undermined parliamentary democracy. On the other hand, remember we looked at this in a previous podcast about how democratic was Germany. There's a counter-argument. In November 1923, when the Stresemann government used Article 48. Parliament, the Reichstag, the SPD, effectively rescinded the right of Stresemann to use Article 48, withdrew it. So that shows that the parliamentary system could still work. It could challenge excessive authoritarian action by the government. The Chancellorship also pursued an effective economic policy, you could argue. Okay, so the cuts in expenditure, the budgetary controls introduced by Stresemann, delegating authority to Schacht and Luther to create the Rentenmark, is all examples of decisive action taken by the government to bring hyperinflation under control. And we've already mentioned the action about instituting the hyperinflation. Well, likewise, Stresemann called to institute the passive resistance. Stresemann called off passive resistance at the right time as well, and tied Germany's economic recovery to a policy of fulfilment in foreign policy terms. And then finally, there's that key sort of horizontal synoptic point. In 1924, the right-wing French government led by Poincaré was replaced by a more moderate one, which was prepared to pull French troops out of the Ruhr, and in the same year, a more moderate Labour government led by Ramsay MacDonald in England wanted to restore harmony in Europe. So all of those developments helped bring the crisis of 1920 to 23 under control. So that again is a slight counter-argument there. It wasn't all due to the weaknesses of the extreme left and the extreme right. It wasn't all due to the strengths of the German government. There were external factors that helped as well. So that gives an added layer to your answer to this particular question. Got to stop there. I've gone over time. Hopefully that was useful to you.